The autumn evening air in Little Italy carried the familiar scents of garlic, basil, and simmering tomatoes. Giuseppe Marcelli stood behind the host's stand of Nonna's Kitchen, his pride and joy for 3 decades. The restaurant's walls were covered with faded photographs of his grandmother, yellowed newspaper clippings praising his authentic recipes, and a collection of certificates from local food festivals. Giuseppe adjusted his stained apron and surveyed his domain with satisfaction. Tonight, like every night, he would educate tourists about real Italian food, the way his nonna had taught him back in Brooklyn Heights. Never mind that Nonna had never actually been to Italy. Giuseppe had built his reputation on her recipes and his own considerable ego. The bell above the door chimed softly as 2 figures entered. Giuseppe's practiced eye immediately assessed them. Early 70s, simple dark clothing, sensible shoes. The man wore a plain wool sweater that had seen better days, while the woman's gray coat looked like something from a department store clearance rack. Classic tourists, Giuseppe thought, probably staying at one of those budget hotels near the Brooklyn Bridge. "Good evening," the woman said quietly, her accent carrying just the faintest trace of something European that Giuseppe couldn't quite place. "Do you have a table for 2? Giuseppe's smile was practiced but condescending. Of course. Right this way." He led them to a small table near the kitchen, not the best spot in the house, but adequate for customers who clearly wouldn't appreciate the finer points of his establishment anyway. As they settled into their seats, Giuseppe noticed the way they examined the restaurant. Not with the wide-eyed wonder of typical tourists, but with a measured, professional assessment that made him slightly uncomfortable. The man's fingers drummed silently on the checkered tablecloth, while his eyes swept over the open kitchen. The woman studied the wine list with an intensity that seemed excessive for someone choosing between a house red and a house white. "Can I start you with some recommendations?" Giuseppe asked, his tone taking on the lecturing quality he reserved for customers who needed education. "Perhaps you'd like to try our famous spaghetti and meatballs? Very authentic, very traditional." The couple exchanged a glance. "Actually," the woman said carefully, "we were hoping to see your pasta selections. Something perhaps with a good ragu?" Giuseppe's laugh was loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. "Ragu! You tourists always ask for ragu. But you don't understand what real ragu is. You probably think it's that sauce you get from a jar at the grocery store, eh?" The man leaned forward slightly. "What makes your ragu authentic?" "Ah." Giuseppe's chest puffed with pride. "My nonna's recipe, passed down through generations. We use ground beef, pork, lots of garlic, heavy cream to make it rich. Cook it for maybe 2-3 hours. That's how real Italians make ragu." The woman's eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly. "Heavy cream?" "Of course. Makes it smooth, creamy. You won't find ragu like this anywhere else in New York. This is the real thing, not like those fancy places in Manhattan that charge $50 for a plate of pasta." Giuseppe noticed the way the couple looked at each other again, some silent communication passing between them. The woman cleared her throat softly. "Perhaps we could also see your wine selection?" "Something Italian?" Certainly. Giuseppe gestured toward the modest wine display behind the bar. "We have Chianti, very good Chianti. Also some nice Pinot Grigio, all imported from Italy, very authentic." The man studied the wine list, his weathered fingers tracing the entries. "This Chianti, from which region?" Giuseppe waved dismissively. "Italy region. Good wine, not too expensive. Perfect for tourists who want to experience authentic Italian dining without breaking the bank." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The woman's voice, when she spoke, carried a new edge. "And your pasta, do you make it fresh?" "Fresh every morning," Giuseppe boasted. "Well, we make it in big batches, very efficient. We use the pasta machine, add some eggs, some oil to make it smooth. Modern techniques, but traditional recipes." The man set down the wine list with deliberate care. "Oil in the pasta dough?" "Of course. Makes it easier to work with, prevents sticking. You probably don't know these professional secrets." That's when the woman began speaking in Italian. Not the tourist phrase book Italian that Giuseppe was accustomed to hearing, but rapid, fluent, precise Italian with the unmistakable cadence of someone born to the language. Her words flowed like music, each syllable perfectly pronounced, carrying the authority of genuine heritage. Giuseppe's face went white. He understood perhaps every third word, despite his claims of authenticity. The woman was speaking far too quickly, far too correctly, for his broken Brooklyn Italian to follow. The man joined in, his Italian equally flawless. They spoke for perhaps 30 seconds, their conversation animated but controlled. Giuseppe caught fragments, something about recipes, about tradition, about respect for ingredients. Then the woman switched back to English, her voice now carrying a subtle but unmistakable authority. "I'm sorry, but I think we may have been mistaken about this establishment." Giuseppe's salesmanship kicked into overdrive. No, please sit. Let me bring you our antipasto. You'll see, this is real Italian food. I've been cooking this way for 30 years. My nonna—" "Your nonna," the man interrupted quietly, "was not Italian." The words hit Giuseppe like a physical blow. "Excuse me?" "Your recipes," the woman continued, her voice gentle but firm, "are not Italian. They are Italian-American, which is a completely different cuisine. Respectable in its own right, but not Italian." Giuseppe's face flushed red. The condescending smile disappeared, replaced by anger and wounded pride. "You don't know what you're talking about. I've been serving authentic Italian food longer than you've probably been eating it. This is real Italian cooking, not some tourist fantasy." The woman reached into her purse and placed a business card on the table. Giuseppe glanced at it and felt his world tilt sideways. The card was simple, elegant, with raised lettering that read, "Dr. Maria Benedetti, Executive Chef, Osteria del Borgo Reale, Milano." Michelin, the man followed suit, producing his own card. Chef Marco Benedetti, Culinary Director, Istituto Culinario Italiano, Milano, James Beard International Award winner. Giuseppe stared at the cards as if they might burst into flames. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his brain struggling to process the information. These weren't tourists. These weren't average customers looking for a nice Italian meal. These were internationally recognized experts in authentic Italian cuisine, and he had just spent 10 minutes lecturing them about real Italian food. You're... Giuseppe stammered. "We're in New York for a culinary conference," Maria said kindly. "We heard about your restaurant and thought we'd experience Italian-American cuisine. We weren't expecting to be educated about our own heritage." Marco leaned back in his chair, his expression not unkind, but unmistakably disappointed. "Your ragu with the heavy cream and excessive garlic, that's not Italian. True bolognese uses only a touch of milk, never cream. Your pasta with oil in the dough, no Italian nonna would recognize that. And Chianti from Italy region." He shook his head. "Chianti comes from very specific areas in Tuscany. Each village produces wine with distinct characteristics." Giuseppe felt the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. But my nonna..." Your nonna adapted Italian recipes to American ingredients and tastes, Maria said gently. There's nothing wrong with that. Italian-American food has its own proud tradition. But it's not Italian food any more than American Chinese food is Chinese. The other diners in the restaurant had begun to notice the conversation. Voices dropped, heads turned, and Giuseppe became acutely aware that his professional humiliation was occurring in front of a full house of customers. Listen, he said, his voice rising defensively. I don't care what your cards say. I've been running this restaurant for 30 years. I know Italian food. My customers love my food. I don't need some tourists telling me how to cook. The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Maria and Marco exchanged another look, this one carrying a weight of sadness and resignation. Marco stood slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified. We'll leave you to your evening, Giuseppe. But perhaps you might consider that authentic cuisine is about more than tradition passed down through immigration. It's about understanding ingredients, respecting techniques that have been refined over centuries, and acknowledging the difference between adaptation and authenticity. As they prepared to leave, Maria paused. Your restaurant could be wonderful if you embraced what it actually is, a celebration of Italian-American innovation. But calling it authentic Italian does a disservice to both cultures. Giuseppe watched them walk toward the door, his pride warring with a growing sense that something fundamental had just shifted. Around him, the restaurant had fallen unnaturally quiet. Customers were staring, some already pulling out their phones. Wait! He called out, but the couple had already disappeared into the autumn night, leaving behind only their business cards and the echoing sound of Giuseppe's world cracking apart. 3 hours later, Giuseppe sat alone in his empty restaurant, staring at his phone screen with the kind of horror usually reserved for natural disasters. The notification had appeared at 11:47 p.m., a tag from the Instagram account at Authentic Italian Eats, one of the most influential food accounts in New York, with over 2 million followers. The post featured a photo of Nonna's kitchen, with a caption that made Giuseppe's blood run cold. When you lecture 2 Michelin-starred chefs from Milano about authentic Italian food. This happened tonight at Nonna's Kitchen in Little Italy. Chef Maria Benedetti, Osteria del Borgo Reale, and Chef Marco Benedetti, Istituto Culinario Italiano, were told by the owner that they don't understand real Italian food. The irony is devastating. Authenticity matters. Little Italy. Italian cuisine. The post already had 50,000 likes and 8,000 comments, most of them scathing. Giuseppe scrolled through them with morbid fascination. Imagine telling a James Beard winner he doesn't know food. This is why real Italians avoid Little Italy tourist traps. The audacity to lecture Milanese chefs about Italian food. Giuseppe really thought he did something, but it was the comment from at Food Network NY that made Giuseppe's hands shake. We'll be featuring this story on tomorrow night's broadcast. Sometimes the best education comes from the most unexpected teachers. Giuseppe's phone buzzed with incoming calls. Reporters, food bloggers, even a producer from a daytime talk show. Each ring felt like another nail in his professional coffin. He let them all go to voicemail. By midnight, the story had been picked up by Gothamist, Eater NY, and the New York Post. The headlines were merciless. Little Italy restaurant owner schools Michelin-starred chefs on real Italian food. The pasta predicament. When fake authenticity meets real expertise. Giuseppe's gaffe. How not to treat world-renowned chefs. Giuseppe poured himself a glass of the Chianti he'd so confidently recommended earlier. The wine tasted bitter, or maybe that was just the taste of hubris. He thought about Maria and Marco's gentle corrections, their patient explanations, the way they'd tried to educate him rather than humiliate him. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had shown more grace in being lectured by an amateur than he had shown in supposedly educating tourists. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his business partner, Tony. "Giuseppe, we need to talk. Emergency meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring the financial statements." Giuseppe knew what that meant. Tony had been looking for an excuse to buy out his share of the restaurant for months. This scandal would give him all the leverage he needed. The next morning brought a crowd of reporters and curious onlookers to Nonna's kitchen. Giuseppe peered through the blinds at the cluster of cameras and microphones, feeling like a prisoner in his own establishment. His phone had accumulated over 200 missed calls and 1,500 text messages, most from people he didn't know expressing opinions he didn't want to hear. At exactly 9 a.m., Tony arrived with his lawyer and a folder thick with documents. Giuseppe didn't need to read them to know what they contained. "Giuseppe," Tony said without preamble, "this is bad. Really bad. The health department called this morning. They're doing a routine inspection next week. The food bloggers are circling like vultures. Our reservations for the next month have been canceled. People are calling us a joke." Giuseppe slumped in his chair. "It was just a misunderstanding, Tony. I didn't know who they were." "That's exactly the problem," Tony's lawyer interjected. "You insulted internationally recognized experts in Italian cuisine because you assumed they were ignorant tourists. The optics are terrible." Tony leaned forward. "I'm offering to buy out your share. Full market value based on last year's earnings, before this disaster. It's more than fair considering the circumstances." Giuseppe looked around the restaurant that had been his life for 3 decades. The faded photographs of his nonna seemed to judge him from their frames. The certificates and awards that had once filled him with pride now felt like monuments to his own self-deception. "I need time to think," he said weakly. "You have until Friday," Tony replied. "After that, I file for dissolution of partnership based on conduct detrimental to the business." After they left, Giuseppe sat alone among the empty tables, remembering the early days when he genuinely believed he was preserving his family's heritage. When had preservation become performance? When had tradition become marketing? His phone buzzed one more time. This message was different, shorter, kinder. "Giuseppe, this is Maria Benedetti. We never intended for last night to become public. If you're interested, we'd like to have a conversation about authentic Italian-American cuisine and its own legitimate place in culinary history. Not everything has to be Italian to be valuable." For the first time in 12 hours, Giuseppe felt something other than despair. He stared at the message for a long time, then slowly began typing his reply. Giuseppe met Maria and Marco at a small cafe in Soho, far from the media circus surrounding Little Italy. They sat at a corner table, 3 people nursing espresso and the awkward weight of viral notoriety. "I want to apologize," Giuseppe began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was arrogant, dismissive, and completely wrong. I let my pride destroy my judgment." Maria stirred her espresso thoughtfully. "Giuseppe, what happened to us happens to many Italian chefs who visit America. The difference is usually people don't lecture us quite so enthusiastically." Marco smiled slightly. "In Milano, we have a saying, the loudest expert usually knows the least. But we also believe that every mistake is a teaching moment." "I don't understand why you're being kind to me," Giuseppe said. "I humiliated myself and insulted you in front of my customers." Because, Maria said gently, we've seen this story before. Many times. Italian Americans trying to connect with a heritage they've never directly experienced, creating their own traditions in the process. There's nothing wrong with that, but problems arise when adaptation is presented as authenticity. Marco leaned forward. Your nonna's recipes. Tell us about her. Not the restaurant version, but the real woman. Giuseppe's eyes softened. She came from Sicily when she was 16. Married my grandfather, who was from Calabria. They were so poor, Maria. She had to make do with whatever ingredients she could afford in Brooklyn in the 1940s. Ground beef instead of multiple meats for ragu because it was cheaper. Heavy cream because milk spoiled too quickly in their icebox. Extra garlic because it was one of the few familiar flavors she could afford. So she was adapting Italian techniques to American circumstances, Maria said. That's not wrong, Giuseppe. That's survival. That's innovation. That's the birth of Italian-American cuisine. But it's not Italian cuisine, Giuseppe said, finally understanding. No, Marco agreed. It's something equally valid but entirely different. The problem isn't your food, Giuseppe. The problem is calling it something it's not. Maria pulled out her phone and showed Giuseppe a photograph of a rustic kitchen in Milano. This is where I learned to cook. 5 generations of my family used this kitchen. We make ragu bolognese with sofrito, 3 meats, wine, tomatoes, and just a touch of milk. It cooks for 4 hours minimum. No cream, no excessive garlic. It's not better than your nonna's version. It's just different. Your nonna created something new, Marco added. She took the soul of Italian cooking, love, family, making do with what you have, and expressed it through American ingredients and circumstances. That's beautiful. That's worthy of respect. But it's not what I grew up eating in Emilia-Romagna. Giuseppe felt tears prick his eyes. I've been living a lie for 30 years. No, Maria said firmly. You've been telling the wrong story. Your nonna's adaptation is a beautiful story. Italian immigrants creating new traditions in a new world, keeping the heart of their culture alive while embracing their new home. That's not a lie. That's American history. Marco nodded. Some of the best Italian-American dishes have no equivalent in Italy. Chicken parmigiana. We don't eat that in Italy. But it's delicious, and it tells the story of Italian immigrants making something new and wonderful. What am I supposed to do now? Giuseppe asked. My reputation is destroyed. My partner wants to buy me out. The restaurant that's been my life is being laughed at across the internet. Maria and Marco exchanged a look. Actually, Maria said slowly, we have a proposition for you. Giuseppe looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in days. We're consultants for a new project, Marco explained. A documentary series about authentic food traditions and their evolution in immigrant communities. We need someone who understands both the pride and the problems of cultural adaptation. You want me to talk about how wrong I was? We want you to talk about how right your nonna was, and how confused you became about the difference between her story and ours, Maria corrected. We want you to help other Italian-American restaurants tell their real stories instead of pretending to be something they're not. Giuseppe stared at them. You're offering me a job after I insulted you? We're offering you a chance to turn a mistake into education, Marco said, but only if you're truly willing to learn. Giuseppe thought about his nonna, about the woman who had created magic with ground beef and heavy cream, because that's what love and poverty and innovation looked like in 1940s Brooklyn. He thought about 30 years of calling her adaptations authentic Italian, when they were something far more interesting, authentic Italian American. "Where do we start?" he asked. 6 months later, Giuseppe stood in the kitchen of a completely transformed restaurant. Gone were the kitschy tourist decorations and fake Italian memorabilia. In their place hung black and white photographs of real Italian-American families, including several of his nonna in her Brooklyn kitchen. The menu was smaller, more focused, and completely honest about what it offered. The sign outside now read, "Nonna's Kitchen, authentic Italian-American cuisine since 1994. "Giuseppe," called Maria from the dining room, "the Food Network crew is ready for the interview." Giuseppe adjusted his chef's coat, a real one this time, not the stained apron he'd worn for decades. He'd spent the past 6 months studying, training, and most importantly, listening. Maria and Marco had introduced him to other Italian-American chefs, who were proud of their heritage, without pretending to be something they weren't. The transformation hadn't been easy. Tony had indeed bought out his partnership, but Giuseppe had used the money to completely reinvent the restaurant. Half of his old customers had abandoned him, offended by his admission that their authentic Italian experiences had been something else entirely. But new customers had come, people drawn by honesty, by the story of adaptation and survival, by food that was proud of what it actually was. The documentary, Lost in Translation, Food Stories of Immigration, had premiered the previous month to critical acclaim. Giuseppe's episode, titled "The Difference Between Authentic and True," had been viewed over 5 million times. Comments ranged from supportive to savage, but Giuseppe had learned to value honesty over popularity. "So Giuseppe," the Food Network host began as cameras rolled, "6 months ago you were known for claiming that Michelin-starred chefs didn't understand Italian food. Now you're being featured as an example of culinary honesty. What changed?" Giuseppe smiled, thinking of his nonna's worn wooden spoon, now displayed in a place of honor behind the bar. "I learned the difference between preserving a culture and pretending to be something you're not. My nonna never claimed to be cooking food from Italy. She was cooking the food of an Italian woman making a life in America. That's a different story, but it's just as valuable. And your relationship with Chefs Benedetti? They taught me that authenticity isn't about geography, it's about honesty. Italian-American food isn't trying to be Italian food any more than Italian food is trying to be French food. They're different expressions of the same underlying truth. Food is love, family, and making the best of what you have." The interview continued for another hour, but Giuseppe's mind wandered to the evening service ahead. They would serve his nonna's ragu, but now the menu honestly described it as Nonna Rosa's Brooklyn ragu, a Depression-era adaptation of traditional Italian techniques using accessible American ingredients. People ordered it knowing exactly what they were getting, and somehow that made it taste better. Maria appeared at his elbow as the crew packed up their equipment. "How does it feel?" "Humbling," Giuseppe replied, "but honest. For the first time in 30 years, I'm not pretending to be something I'm not." Marco joined them, carrying a bottle of wine. "This is from my cousin's vineyard in Chianti. Real Chianti, from the actual region. I thought we should celebrate your 6-month anniversary." They opened the wine and toasted to authentic Italian-American cuisine, to the courage of immigrants who created new traditions, and to the wisdom that comes from admitting when you're wrong. "Giuseppe," Maria said as they finished their wine, "we have another proposition for you." Giuseppe laughed. "The last one worked out pretty well. What is it this time?" "We're opening a consulting firm for restaurants that want to tell their real stories instead of fake ones. We need someone who understands both sides of cultural authenticity. Interested?" Giuseppe looked around his transformed restaurant, at the honest menu, at the photographs of real people creating real food in real circumstances. He thought about his nonna, who would have been both horrified by his arrogance and proud of his eventual honesty. When do we start? 1 year later, Giuseppe stood before a packed auditorium at the James Beard Foundation, delivering a lecture titled, "The Courage to Be What You Are: Authenticity versus Accuracy in Immigrant Cuisine." In the audience sat dozens of restaurant owners, many of whom had contacted him after seeing his story. They came seeking permission to be proud of their adaptations, their innovations, their survival stories disguised as family recipes. Authenticity, Giuseppe told them, isn't about perfect adherence to tradition. It's about perfect honesty about what you're actually doing. My nonna's ragu isn't bolognese, but it's authentic to her experience as an Italian woman making a life in America. That story is worth telling truthfully. After his talk, a young chef approached him. "Mr. Marcelli, I run a Mexican-American restaurant in Texas. My grandmother's recipes aren't exactly Mexican, but they're not exactly Tex-Mex either. I've been afraid to be honest about what we're serving." Giuseppe smiled, thinking of Maria and Marco's patient teaching, of his own painful education in the difference between pride and pretension. "Tell your grandmother's story," he said. "Tell it exactly as it happened. A woman adapting her culture to new circumstances, creating something beautiful and new. That's not less than authentic Mexican food. It's different. And different doesn't mean inferior." As Giuseppe walked home through Little Italy that night, he passed other restaurants still advertising authentic cuisine from homelands their owners had never seen. He felt no judgment, only compassion. He understood the desire to connect with heritage, the fear that adaptation might mean abandonment. But he also understood now that the most powerful authenticity comes from honesty, about who you are, where you come from, and what you're really serving when you invite people to your table. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Saw your lecture online. Nonna Rosa would be proud." Giuseppe smiled, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city lights. Yes, he thought. She would be. Not because he'd finally learned to cook like an Italian, but because he'd finally learned to cook like what he actually was. The grandson of an Italian woman who'd had the courage to create something new in a new world. That, Giuseppe had learned, was the most authentic story of all. Have you ever met someone who taught you the difference between being right and being honest? Share their story in the comments below. If this story moved you, subscribe to Untold Legends. We believe that the most powerful truths often come from admitting we were wrong.